How could we develop something like a human-centered technology in today's world? And can the idea of universal fraternity help us get there? Technology goes back to the dawn of human civilization. One of the core indicators that archaeologists use to identify human remains is the presence of tools in archaeological fields. Evolutionary anthropology suggests that we have two basic ways of interacting with the world. One is the face way, which is holistic, recognizing the way things are. The other is the hand way, which intervenes in the world, using and controlling it. The part of our brains that deals with tools is associated with the part that we use for words. These are all tools we use to interact with the world around us.
Very early technologies, things like the hand axe, and it was all things that helped us kind of shift the world, shape the world in some way. And then once we get into kind of the era of media, of kind of information media, whether that's writing, print, and then electric media later on, increasingly the technology becomes our kind of totalizing environment. It's not just a tool that we use to accomplish a task. It's sort of the background within which we kind of do anything in our lives. And so now, the amount of time people spend on devices every day, and our ability to kind of have everything in the world and anybody in the world in our pockets anytime, it certainly turns kind of the digital computing ecosystem, internet, into our primary environment.
Thinkers like Louis Mumford, Howard Rosenbrock, and Karol Wojtyła, later Pope John Paul II from Poland, they all identified two basic forms of technological development. The first, which they call respectively biotechnic, that's Mumford's word, human-centered, that's Rosenbrock's word, or man's ally, that's Pope John Paul II's words. This type of technology is inserted into a holistic framework of life. It is designed to make a way of life more rich, productive, and interesting. The second kind, which they call respectively monotechnic, technocentric, or almost man's enemy, is self-referential, detached from or unleashed from any particular way of life. Ways of life have to adapt themselves to this form of technology, not the other way around. So it's very open to be used by powerful groups in society to achieve their ends, even if this damages the human community as a whole.
One of the technologies I talked about was an older technology but I think illustrates this kind of dichotomy between, on one hand, the technocentric approach, or an approach that sees humans as a means and not an end, versus the more human-centered approach, which actually takes the interest of humans into account. And that technology was the electric light, which when it first came out, it was extremely harsh. It was used as a weapon even in wars, and it was not very useful for much of anything. But so when Thomas Edison came along, he created the incandescent light bulb, which was a softer light that was more useful for people's needs, and it made the electric light more like the previous form of lighting, the gas light. So it's an interesting, I think, example of where innovation and going forward with the technology looks like going backward in a way, but it really is ultimately about aligning it with sort of the needs and the desires of humans.
The important thing to realize is that we can find examples of both technological development throughout history. In the Science Museum in London, for instance, you can see examples of each type side by side. On the one hand, there is the spinning jenny, invented in the 1770s by a spinner, designed to make his specialized skill more productive, at that stage by about 8 times. The spinning jenny was designed to be integrated into and enhance an existing productive and skilled kind of work. On the other, there is the self-acting mule, which was designed not by a spinner trying to enhance his own skill, but by an engineer who was commissioned to invent a machine that would take all the skill out of the job of spinning, a machine that could be run by a child or a monkey. That was what he was told to do. Or now we might say a robot. The spinning jenny and the self-acting mule are not just two different inventions. They reflect two different mindsets about the purpose and design of technology. Is this a fair diagnosis of the problem? The idea that there are two paths that technological development can take, and mainstream economic theory tends to favor the technocentric path, while philosophical and religious traditions tend to favor the other, more human-centered path.
Human-centric is perhaps not slightly the right word. Today we also have to think about other stakeholders, like nature. Or technology can also impact communities, families, multiple groups of people. So I'd rather call it stakeholder-centered technology, but then center again also and is really much, as if we were spotting. And that's difficult. I think humans are in relations with technology. So it's rather a stakeholder relational understanding of technology that is bringing us forward. My impression is that technology design, both in the US and in China, is first of all very much efficiency driven, seeking performance, seeking extra functionality, ever new possibilities. And it's an external growth strategy, as most of our economic system has been pursuing for the past 200-300 years. It's always external growth. So here technology doesn't nourish the user or the human or the social system using the technology, but it nourishes some growth ideology.
The problems that we have today with social media, AI, and other digital technologies emerge from an approach that is technocentric, producing big profits for a few major players via the use of advertising, even though research, as well as personal experience, show the many negative effects of these current technologies. We have more experience with social media than AI. These platforms could have been produced in a human-centered way, but they have not been developed like that. And we can see the results of this, especially for young people. Let us hope that in the case of AI, we still have a chance to influence its development in a more human-centered direction.
Gambling machines, for instance, they're human-centered in a shallow sense, in the sense that they are highly optimized to the reward pathways of people, their brains, but not in the sense that it's optimized to their well-being or flourishing or anything like that. So they can be used to exploit people, right? But persuasive technology, you can imagine really good uses of persuasive technology. If I want to stay in contact with friends, for instance, and I'm just really bad at remembering to message them every week, I could have a system that nudges me into doing that and knows why I'm not doing it and helps me do it. So I think it's really just a question of alignment with our goals and with our well-being. It's important to think about these kinds of things because, especially in these debates about AI and all of this stuff, we spent 10-15 years talking about these other platforms like social media, and very rarely was it really brought to the fore in those conversations that they're not really designed to advance sociality. They're designed to persuade us in one way or another. They're big persuasion machines.
Now, these days, it's not only about functionality or efficiency, but it's also about you being effective of manipulating other people. A lot of the technology is catered to business models. So that's going beyond functionality, or it's really not only business models these days, but it's about using people as actuators, also using people as extensions of technology and manipulating them into behavior. For example, voting for certain parties, going to the streets, things like that. So behind the technology-driven term, you have a lot of dynamics these days. I do think that technology now has become too human-centered in the sense of manipulating human cognition, working with dopamine cycles to make them addicted. This all goes under usability, ease of use kind of technologies. Yes, it's user-centered, but it's too human-centered. It's manipulative. as it's viciously human-centered.
Well, this is where the ideas of fraternity and solidarity come in. Solidarity builds us together in the face of threats and can help us build a more just and human society, a true common good. Fraternity allows us to promote human freedom and diversity within that shared common good. Can the idea of universal fraternity help us develop a more robust defense of the human-centered approach? How? Are there any good examples or models already in existence that can highlight this?
Just talking about how I was understanding fraternity for the purposes of this discussion, and I juxtapose it with common humanity and human dignity. And so our common humanity, to me, is a term that helps us think about who we are, what we have in common, kind of the baseline that all other kind of moral and practical reasoning can be based on. Then on top of that, dignity is kind of the question not of who we are, but what we owe each other. What's the minimum amount of respect that's owed someone by virtue of being human? And then thirdly, fraternity would be sort of not just that minimum level of respect or honor or consideration that's due the person, but a more positive stance that has to do with what we can do for the other person, how we should relate to each other, how we should engage. So it's kind of a move from the kind of the negative view of the minimum viable morality that comes with dignity to a more positive approach.
Stakeholder-centered technology enabled through value-based engineering. All the projects we did show that in the end, the solution is fostering fraternity. It's working towards relationality. It's enabling the people in a good sense through discourse ethics, embracing various stakeholders of a system of interest, cooperating to understand what value could be brought forth, could be nourished, could be fostered through the technical capability. And this is really what we are working to. And if there are values like privacy or security that could be undermined by a technology, or also the virtue, the honor, the dignity, the freedom that could be undermined by technology, we design the technology in such a way that we prohibit technically and organizationally that these negative value potentials unfold. And so this approach of value-based engineering is working towards the good and prohibiting the bad.
I think at a high level, fraternal technology, it would be similar to technologies that are aligned with our well-being. It would just be, there would be a kind of a particular attention to the relational quality of them. So that would mean that they would be respectful of our attention and wouldn't be distracting us from what we were trying to do or who we wanted to talk to. They would actually prioritize our actual fulfilling relations and not substitute them with likes and little emojis and things like that, as cool as they sometimes can be. I think it would be respectful of our intentions. Sometimes I use the GPS as a metaphor. If a GPS device, you use it and it took you to a completely different city instead of where you wanted to go, you would never keep using it. But it seems like that's kind of what we do with our social technologies, our informational technologies on a daily basis. The majority of people regret the advent of social media, and yet the majority of people still use social media. So I think that it would be respectful of our intentions, our goals. I think it would be aware of who we are at a deep level and not just at a surface level. So it wouldn't just know that I was in a particular place or searching for a particular thing this day. It would know what I wanted to do this week or this month. If I could tell all of my technologies that my goal for this year was to write another book, and all of my technologies were pulled into in support of that project, it would actually be pretty incredible. And I think it's not implausible technologically, it's just we need to have the right kind of incentive structure there to do it. So I think intention aware, intention respectful.
The way I understand the term, it's about human flourishing. And human flourishing comes about when you use technology and it enriches your life and it gives you value. It gives you knowledge and it respects your privacy. It increases your dignity and doesn't undermine it. So as a result of, let's say, in human-computer interaction, nourishing values and unfolding value potentials through the technical interaction is creating human flourishing.
Yeah, so I think they would be technologies that that take us into experiences of depth and not out of them. So there's something I've been kind of looking around my world for lately. I started to call them depth triggers, where it's like I'll hear a line of poetry or something, and it'll get me to sort of open up a book and take me into experience of depth. So it's where our automatic part of our brains is actually activated, but in a way that ultimately leads us into an experience of depth, of cognitive complexity. And so I think that, it's not impossible for us to design more of those kinds of depth triggers or little rabbit holes into the vita contemplativa and using digital technologies. So I think that all of these things that kind of relate to well-being, to flourishing, to the kinds of fulfilling relations that people, when they're on their deathbeds, are going to look back and remember and appreciate. I think those are the kinds of things that technology really ought to be helping us, have more of. Otherwise, I'm not sure what it's for.
Yeah, I think a very nice example for a stakeholder embracing technology design approach was the YOMA project that we did for UNICEF. And we applied value-based engineering as it is specified in the ISO 7000 standard. And here really the project started with the design thinking way of saying, why don't we take a lot of data about the African youth from telephone networks and from various providers, and we pool it all, and then we calculate with an AI the talent. It was just a terrible surveillance capitalist vision of technology design. And we brought in value-based engineering, and we talked to the stakeholders, and we saw how afraid they are about their privacy laws and what they really wanted from the platform. And then we built a talent platform which gives full control of the data to the African youth, and where they can nourish their talents, where they stay in their communities, where they mentor each other, where they can do projects, where they show project by project where they build their CVs online. And this is really progressive. Yeah.
A lot of the time we use a GPS as a metaphor for where, kind of almost the ideal standard of technology, like it ought to help us go where we want to go in our lives. And I think, if you look at the GPS, sat-nav, as they say in the UK, it's pretty human-centered in its design. And I think technologies that guide us through physical space tend to be, I think, pretty human-centered, because it's pretty obvious to see when they're not going right. So I think that the GPS is a really good one. I mean, there are certainly things they could do to make it more human-centered or more maybe value-sensitive. Like, they could say, do you want to take the scenic route today or the fast route? But they do have things in there now where it says, do you want to take the eco-conscious route or the fast route? So I think that those navigational kinds of technologies are a good example.
My vision would be that engineers take the attitude of a gardener. A gardener has an attitude of care, has a long-term perspective, is looking very clearly at the outset, the realistic outset of the garden, the earth and the light. And engineers, from my perspective, need to do the same thing.